I'm honored to bring you this interview with Elizabeth Bechard Matteson. Elizabeth shares about her experience of parenting her children and her contemplation around whether or not to teach her children to love the planet or to protect them from the heartbreak connected to us potentially losing the planet due to our behaviors and patterns. We discuss grief not being a linear process and what it would look like to normalize the experience of grief instead of to pathologize it. Elizabeth Bechard Matteson is an integrative fertility coach and a yoga teacher in Durham, North Carolina. In early 2016, she became the mother of two spirited children after a complicated journey to motherhood that included multiple miscarriages, fertility treatments, donor conception, and a challenging pregnancy. This winding road to parenthood led her to focus her coaching practice on supporting other individuals navigating fertility challenges and pregnancy loss. Over the past several months, she has been immersed in learning about the intersections between eco-anxiety, climate grief, and the process of building families after noticing these themes emerge repeatedly in her own life and the lives of her clients. I hope you enjoy this interview. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi.
Good to see you. Thanks for saying yes to being part of the Healing and Community online summit focused on grief and liberation.
Mm.
I'm thrilled that you're here. And we met, I don't know what year it was, but several years ago, I was leading a workshop at Carver Yoga on yoga and social justice, and you came to that workshop. And we connected there. And then I followed your work, and I think we connected online a lot, actually, through social media.
Right.
And right before
Right.
I was, moving to Portland, we met for tea. And lunch, one thing I remember is you brought some flower essences, which I actually still have, or some oils. I still have one. It's on my altar. I was looking at it this morning, so it's really sweet to connect with you
Okay.
today and be like,
Good.
oh, it's still here. I carried it with me and brought it back across the country. So
Wonderful.
I just remember how thoughtful you were about um, helping me prepare for that move. And one thing I'll never forget is that you talked about me thinking about how I wanted it to be when I moved there. Like, so there's the move, right? And then there's the how do you want this experience to be? And I never forgot that. Like, I started to make a list of how I wanted it to be, and continue that practice as I start new things. So thank you for that.
Well,
that
thank
gift.
you.
Yeah, thanks. So I'd like us to start with a moment of centering before we dive into the conversation. So you can find a comfortable way to be in your body. And folks listening can find a comfortable way to be in your body. And you can close your eyes or you can soften your gaze. And just take a moment here to turn your attention to your breath. Begin to feel your inhales and exhales. And begin to deepen and lengthen your breath in your body. And take a moment to notice how you feel physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. What is present for you? And now as you breathe, just take a moment to notice your heart space and your heartbeat. Notice what you're holding in your heart. And take a few more cycles of breath here, connecting with your heart and what is present there. And as you feel ready, you can open your eyes and reorient to the space.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, of course. So I'd love to hear a little bit about um, the work you do in the world, and maybe even why you said yes to a conversation about grief
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
liberation. Yeah.
Yeah. So I am an integrative fertility coach, and I work um, primarily in that realm with people who are navigating significant challenges with trying to conceive, whether whether those challenges are fertility challenges or pregnancy loss. So people who it just hasn't happened easily or the way that they thought it was going to. And that's kind of a variety of modalities woven into that: coaching, yoga, essential oils, writing. So I take a really holistic mind body approach in that work. Um, and I also work as a clinical research coordinator at an integrative medicine clinic, and sort of specialize around interventions for resilience, for trauma as well. So I get to be, both a coach and a research nerd as well.
Mhm.
And to answer your question about why I said yes, I actually love talking about grief. I think it's one of those things that is stigmatized in our culture, and that we would rather hide it away and pretend it's not happening. I see that all the time in my coaching clients, that people are shocked by how much grief they feel over an inability to conceive easily, or the inability to conceive the way that they thought they would, or the grief over a pregnancy loss and miscarriage being just profoundly more intense than they thought it should be.
Mhm.
And so I think any conversation that we can have that destigmatizes grief and normalizes it and brings it more out in the open is really healthy and important. So I'm always excited to talk about grief. So
Mhm. Mhm. Me too, obviously.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm wondering about why you feel like it's important, just at this time, given what's going on culturally, politically in our communities, why it's important to discuss grief. And you might also name your connection. I'm tying grief and liberation together, like I'm
Yeah.
connecting them. So if that resonates, you can share some about that too. Why is it important to be talking about grief and liberation now?
Mm. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I would say it's probably always been important to talk about grief, even though we haven't done it. But, the past few years of the political climate that we've had have really, it's really ripped the Band-Aid off of a lot of collective wounds um, inflicted by white supremacy and capitalism. And they're all really intimately connected, right? Racism and xenophobia and climate collapse, all of those things are sort of the wounds, caused by the same arrows, if you will. And, in many ways, my work is moving more and more towards climate grief and, in parents and people who are trying to conceive. And, one of the things that just makes it very urgent now is that I'm not sure our species will survive in the next 100 years or more if we don't find ways to really address the core issues that are causing these wounds. So it's not that it hasn't always been important. It's just that I'm not sure we'll survive as a species if we don't find a way to take collective action that sort of liberates us from, these, I don't know how to describe it, but these chains that we're all in, and the future that's heading our way if we don't make some serious changes as a society.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Mm.
And in listening, I'm thinking about grief and how I might define that differently based on the context. And so I'm just wondering, when you think about grief, how do you conceptualize that? Like and context may shift your how you
Yeah.
conceptualize it. Any thoughts about that, what it means to you?
Yeah, I think for me, I think about, it absolutely, it's dependent on the context, in terms of the loss of a thing, right? It's the other side of what it meant to have loved the thing, right? Or loved the
Mm-hmm.
idea of a thing, right? It's the loss of a person, or a person who might have been, or a future that you thought you would have, right? This grief over an idea or a thing that you have loved. But there's also a broader sense of collective, grief, right, over this wounds in our society, right, over systems of oppression that are harming, broad swaths of people. Um, that is different, and I think, again, I think all of it's interconnected. Of course, there's anticipatory grief as well. I think about climate destruction. There is the loss. We are losing things already, right? So some of that is grief or loss of things that we have loved, but it's also like this anticipatory grief of, like, the future that our children might not have, that we thought they were supposed to have. So the grief of things, futures that might not play out, that's very real too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I'd love for you to share about some lessons you've learned from the process of grieving.
Yeah, I was thinking about that, and before we were talking, and I think when I think back to all of my significant grief experiences, they've all taught me something on some variation on the theme of, like, how to love more fully. But one specific experience that I remember was related to one of my early profound grief experiences. When I was 19, I lost a good friend to suicide, and we happened to live together at that time. We were living in a community home together, and the night before she died, she and I were up late talking that night, and yeah, I knew she was having a hard time. And one of the things I remember telling her was, I shared this practice with her of writing down a list of all the things that I loved, all of the things that made me happy. And, the little things and the big things, right? All of it matters. And so all of it goes on the list. And I remember the next morning, I didn't see her that morning, but I remember her list was taped to my door. And I still remember some of the things that were on that list, right? And like yellow roses and twirly skirts. I have this visual memory of some of the items on that list. And of course, the next morning when we found her, the list was, all the more devastating because I was so blindsided by her death, and I hadn't seen it coming. But in the years that have gone by since then, over 15 years now, like, I've finally come to understand that her leaving that list behind was actually an incredible gift, to leave, like, this record of the things that she had loved about the world. And to me, that was just an amazing legacy that to leave behind, right? This is what I have loved, on this planet during these moments that I was here. Here is what I gave my heart to. Of course, it took me many years to see it that way. But I think, her death and the way that it happened, and the list of the things that she loved, that she left behind, have really, gifted me a sense of, like, urgency and loving everything now. Um, whether it's people or, those little moments of joy, like, it all matters, I think, a lot more than we think it does. Um, so that's been like one of the gifts, you know, to love what is now, like as if it might be your last day, you know. So,
Mm-hmm. How do you practice that yourself, loving everything now? What does that look like for you?
yeah, I mean that's a great question, and it's a practice I am leaning into in some ways more slowly than others. You know, I remember having this debate within myself last year after my grandmother died. She had lived in Wilmington for most of her 97 years, and you know, generations of my family have lived there. And Wilmington is kind of like the only place where I feel like I have a really deep sense of ancestral roots. And and of course, Wilmington also happens to be one of the places in the country that's, you know, facing a greater increase in hurricane-related flooding, you know, due to climate change, right? And so my kids were very young, you know, then, and still are pretty young. I remember like asking myself, you know, now that my grandmother has gone and my family, there's no one living down there anymore. Do we keep bringing the kids down to Wilmington so that they will learn to love this place that we've always loved, or that I've always loved? You know, do I teach them to love this place, or do I protect them from the heartbreak of losing this place? You know, knowing that, you know, Wilmington is likely to face more and more devastation due to hurricanes and flooding, like that is on the horizon. Um, and so, you know, ultimately, like I've made a conscious decision, like, yes, we will keep taking them, you know, we want them, but I will practice this, you know, loving what is by teaching them to love what is. And, you know, even if it means risking like greater heartbreak. Um, so I think, you know, one practice right now is like, I'm going to take my kids to the beach next weekend, you know, even though I have like bittersweet feelings about this, so that they can learn to love that. And, um, you know, I try to invite tangible reminders of what I've loved and lost in my life as well. You know, with my grandmother's death, for example, I have a bottle of, you know, perfume that she used to love, right? And I smell that when I want to remember her.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it's bittersweet, but it's also like I love that she loved it, and it's a way of like kind of bringing her with me, you know, into this moment and the next moment and the next moment. So I think um, yeah, loving tangible things is important, even if it, you know, might seem a little bit material at time. You know, like that little bottle of perfume like means everything to me, and I would rescue it from the house like if it were burning, like after my kids.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so yeah, those are some of the things that come to mind.
Mm-hmm. One thing that really struck me in what you said about the ocean and taking your kids there, and you also named this earlier about the environment and that we're losing something right now, right? We're, you know, it's
Yeah,
not necessarily anticipatory grief, right? Because we have evidence that the climate's changing and that we're responsible for that
right.
in how we live and whether or not we're good stewards of this planet and our time here on the planet. And I was struck because I hear attention in like what is heartbreaking right now and being present with that, and also um, being aware of what needs to shift, right? What needs to change.
Right.
And so I'm curious about what do you feel, what's breaking your heart right now? Like what is when you know you have an experience in a body on this planet and you're aware of systems because you've named them. Like what is causing the most heartbreak right now for you?
Mm, yeah, it's a great question. I mean, right now I'm kind of in a self-imposed immersion around climate change. Like I'm taking a few courses on climate and health, so that is the thing that is like most present for me right now. But you know, on a very visceral level, I think about how it's getting hotter in North Carolina, and how I've, you know, in my class, I've been looking at the graphs of, you know, what's likely to happen in the coming decades, and how, you know, by 2050, things look radically different than they do now. And what does that mean for me, you know, as a parent, right? Like, and knowing that, you know, I want my kids to grow up, you know, being safe outdoors, and they might not be safe outdoors in the way that I was as a kid. And you know, I don't know if their generation will feel comfortable having children, you know, in a world that is, when they're my age, going to be exponentially more uncertain potentially than it is now. And so I think, again, when I think about the clients that I work with around the fertility and pregnancy loss, it's heartbreaking when you desperately want a child and can't have one, or you lose one. And I think for me, what I'm feeling personally is like this fear of like, what will my children's lives be like? Will my daughter, when she's in her 30s or 20s or 30s, like wonder if it's safe or okay or ethically right to bring a child into the world at that point? And what does that mean for her grief, and for my grief, will I not become a grandmother because of climate change, right? Like that's real. And I think about how many people that will affect, and how, climate change travels down, already really well-worn pathways of inequity, right? I'm a white person living in a very privileged life, and, the people, who are already hit hardest by health disparities and are already vulnerable populations are seeing these effects already at a much greater level, and will see them at a much higher intensity. What does it mean for their desire to, raise families or have children? And so my heart is breaking for children right now, and for those who are parenting children and those who love children in any capacity, really. And there's no easy answers for that. And it's hard at times to sit with the fact that there's no right thing to do about whether or not to have a child, right? It's a big, painful gray area right now. That's breaking my heart.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What allows you to open your heart? Because I'm just thinking about all that you said. I don't have children. I mean, I love children and I don't have them. I haven't birthed a child, and don't parent a child. And it just struck me when you said, are my children going to have children? Is there going to be a generation that doesn't have children because of what's going on in the climate, with the climate, and just culturally? Because I didn't have children because the world feels really overwhelming, and I contemplated what would it mean for me to bring a Black baby,
right,
or a child of color into the world. So it just struck me when you said that, and yet I think your heart is still open, or you wouldn't do the work you do.
right.
And so I'm wondering about that. That feels like liberation to me, or resilience. You named that earlier with the research that you do, juxtaposed to the fertility coaching that you do. Like, what allows you to keep your heart open?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think on the other side of birthing children, for me, it feels like they're the reason, right? And I would find another reason if I didn't have children, I'm sure. Right now, they're the most immediate and present reason because they consume so much of my energy, and it's like what they still find wonder in nature. One of our family rituals is to go out on nature walks outside, or adventure walks as they like to call them. They're very low-key adventures, but to go out and bring a bowl outside and look for acorns or gumballs, like that is still, they're 3, and that's amazing to them. And it's a real, as heartbreaking as it is to sort of know what may be coming for their future, like I also really don't want to miss your childhood either. And so I don't want to miss like the wonder of, seeing the sunrise in the morning with them, or, listening to the birds. And so I think that keeps my heart open. And also just, having a lot of personal experience of having my heart closed after experiences of grief, and like dealing with that in all the wrong ways. Like I've been down that road before, for many years at a time, and it certainly didn't allow me to function in a happy life or a joyful life, or even to have access most of the time to happiness or joy. And so it's both my kids and like I've been down the other road, and I kind of know where that leads me. And our time is limited, right? I want to love big now, and enjoy this life because it is a gift, and I'm here and I want to enjoy it. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What rituals do you or practices do you engage to both support you in moving through grief? But what you just said made me think about the second part of the question. So also like to love big, that struck me when you said that. So what rituals or practices do you engage to move through grief or wade through it, and to be in the practice of loving big, right? And remembering this lifetime as a gift.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for me, the practices for navigating grief have actually been a little bit different for each experience of it. Oddly enough, as I think about it, I remember one practice that I did that was really meaningful was when my grandmother died last summer. I was with her for several hours a day during the last month of her life, and every day I went home and I just wrote like everything I could remember, everything I could remember about that day, about the way that it smelled, who came in, who said what my grandmother said or didn't. Like I just recorded everything. And I guess what was a grief journal, although I didn't name it that at the time, but it was also an opportunity to reflect on like the memories I had of her as well. And so I have, maybe 100 pages of writing from that month of her life, of just, and the months that followed as well, of this record of her death, but also a celebration of her life. So writing, has been a really helpful practice in that way. For my pregnancy losses, I remember I had a miscarriage 10 years ago at a time in my life when I had no tools, and that was very painful. But when we got pregnant in 2015, we got pregnant with triplets, and we lost one of the triplets during the pregnancy. And by that point in my life, I had an awareness that I needed some support around that in a different way. And it really struck me at the time, with more, I guess, inner resources, how with pregnancy loss, it's just most of the time an invisible loss in society. You have nothing to show for it. You don't usually get a funeral. There's no tangible sort of thing that our culture does to acknowledge the loss of a baby or a pregnancy. And I remember sort of Googling this to see what I could find, and I remember finding that in Japanese culture, there is this tradition of the Jizo figurine, and I actually brought one to show y'all today. But the Jizo is like a deity in this tradition that helps to usher children who have died or babies who've died into the next world, the afterlife. And for me, getting a little Jizo figurine was really powerful, and that's it's a tangible thing that I can look at, on my altar and remember my losses. So I think tangible practices are really, really useful, whether it's writing or having a thing that's a reminder. My grandmother's perfume too, that's another ritual, smelling her perfume when I miss her. For me, all of that is connected to this like practice of loving the world, right? And the world is a physical thing. And so engaging in physical practices with things I can touch has meant a lot to me with grief work.
And what do you feel like it might look like? Because you were just talking about rituals related to loving the world and acknowledging your losses, and continually doing that, engaging in that practice. And so I'm wondering what it might look like, what you think it would look like if our larger culture prioritized space for us to practice in the way you just named, in a more collectively to bite and to acknowledge what we're losing, even as we're in the practice of loving the world. What would that look like for you?
I think what would have to happen, like as the foundation for all of that, would be to destigmatize grief and to normalize it and not to pathologize it. a few weeks ago, I went to a training by a group called Being Here Human. They do grief literacy work, and they talked in that training about how much the pharmaceutical industry benefits from the pathologizing of grief. And that really struck me as being true to my personal experience, true to my professional experience, that we give grief a timeline in our culture. We say you have this many days, hours, however long to experience this, and you get to experience this range of emotions. And if your experience doesn't fit into that neat little box, you're depressed, or you're anxious, or you're bipolar, or you have you get a diagnosis, and often there's a medication that goes along with that. And I will not shame medication at all. I think some people really benefit from it, and if you really want medication, feel you benefit from it, more power to you. But grief is not an illness, right? It's not, nobody, it's not an illness, right? It's a normal process that we all experience, and yet it's treated like something that industries can make money off of, because we treat it like a problem. And so finding ways to destigmatize that, would be a really important piece. I mean, the work that this group is doing around grief literacy is really important, and like teaching people, like, here is a normal grief process. And they really kind of debunk the Kubler-Ross model of grief as being outdated and used in ways that it was never meant to be used. And so I think their work around educating people about what normal grief looks like, and giving people healthy tools to metabolize grief, is really important. I remember, an incident that happened maybe a year and a half ago now. I was presenting at a local loss group at our fertility center, a group for people who had experienced pregnancy loss. And there was a woman there who had experienced 2 stillbirths in a row. So, of course, tremendous grief around that. And she clearly was presenting with a low affect, and her doctor apparently had told her that she was depressed and needed to be on medication, but she really didn't want to be on medication. She was just like not into the medication. And I can understand, like, I was sitting there listening, not facilitating the group, being a guest there, thinking, well, of course she doesn't want to be on medication. She wants to have another child. Like, what woman who'd had 2 stillbirths in a row would want to introduce a medication that could increase the chances of that happening again, right? Like, it made complete sense to me why she wouldn't want that. And yet the group facilitator's response was to, like, just try to get her to take the medication because that's what the doctor had said. And so no other practices were even offered to this woman. No, nothing, like, just take the pill was clearly the message. And again, I don't shame medication for a minute, but like, what I saw happening was this like medical trauma in real time of, the medical system, like, ignoring this woman's grief, like, just take a pill, right? That's what you need, rather than offering her tools to metabolize that and to process and integrate it. And so I think it would go a long way if providers were trained, people who are therapists or doctors or, helping professionals in other capacities were trained to recognize normal grief, and not to immediately pathologize it, but to have more resources to help people heal what is a normal response to something terrible happening. And if we had, a healthcare system and a support system, collectively, that acknowledged that grief is a normal response to pain, to loss and pain, I think people would use those tools instead of immediately turning to things that numb out. And wow, like, what an amazing world that would be, right, if we had that kind of support.
Yeah, and what you just said about pathologizing grief and the medical system or healthcare system or unhealthy system, as I call it most of the time, it just made me think about how healthcare professionals, their grief is pathologized too, or in fact, they're like conditioned to dissociate from it. And so I think training would help, and space for them to grieve too, because they're seeing loss after loss after loss, like secondary trauma. And they also are dealing with their own grief too, or not, right? But it's there. So it just made me think about what would that look like, in addition to training for folks who are encountering more loss just directly because of the work they do.
Oh yeah, first responders of
To
any
have space to process that. Yeah, yeah, that would likely make a difference in care, right, and how people are cared for.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that might even need to happen first. You know.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
And I think I have two more questions. What do you feel like, so we're talking about like making space or prioritizing grief culturally, and how does that connect to liberation for you, or
Mm.
freedom, whatever word you want to use? I'm just using liberation. What's the connection to collective liberation if we actually prioritize space to grieve?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I know that from my personal experience, like I have this visceral experience of understanding grief as the other side of the coin of love, right? Like they're intimately, they're the same thing, right? They're together. You can't separate
Mm-hmm.
them. And so collectively, you know, we if we numb out our capacity to grieve, we also numb out our capacity to love, right? And you know, a lack of true deep love is at the root of a lot of, you know, problems in our society. And you know, not just be cliche about it, you know, but I think if we, you know, as a culture, we're able to grieve what we have lost, to grieve what we have done to each other, what we have done to the environment, we would also have more freedom to love, you know, to love each other, to love the planet. You know, we don't protect what we don't love, right? And so, you know, if we don't make space to grieve, we'll lose our capacity to protect each other, literally, I feel, and the planet, literally, right? If we don't teach each other, if we don't teach our children to love the planet, they're not going to protect it, right? Um, yeah, I think it comes down to that connection between grief and love, right? We can't love if we're not free to grieve as well.
Yeah, and the kind of love that I hear you talking about, it feels, because I do a lot of anti-racism work, people will talk about racism is based in fear or hate or a lack of love, and that's true, and it's also deeper
Right,
than that.
right,
And so I hear you talking about we won't protect something if we don't care for it. Like if we don't value it, we're not going to take care of
right,
it. So if we don't value the planet, or we don't value certain people moving on this planet, then we're not going to care for them. We're not going to see their humanity. So
right.
I really appreciate the way you talked about that, because it's deeper than let's all love each other, right? The way I heard you say it is more like
Right.
it has to do with value and what we do when we care about something or someone.
Yeah,
And what happens when we don't, which we can so clearly see. I mean, there's evidence everywhere of the impact of devaluing people and dehumanizing people and harming the planet
right,
and beings on the planet.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the love that you know, that is possible when we grieve freely is like a fiercer love, right? It's really like warrior love, that we would do anything to protect each other. We would do anything to protect the planet. You know, if we lose access to that, you know, we've lost a lot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm. Well, is there anything else you want to share before I move us to talking about some work that's coming up for you?
I don't think so, except that I just really appreciate you and the space that you are creating for this, because I know that even though people like us might love talking about grief, you know, it's not something that everybody is necessarily comfortable with or excited about. And I really appreciate that you are, you know, making, you know, major steps in helping to destigmatize, you know, this. It's really important and really valuable. And I am personally deeply grateful for it. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad you're part of this, and part of opening up or deepening the conversation about grief, so that it is destigmatized, right? And we have more space to actually acknowledge what's going on inside of us, around us, in our communities and collectively. So thank you.
Mm.
So I'd love for you to share some about what's coming up for you and your work. And I know you're creating some workshops around climate change.
Yeah.
What's coming up in the next year for you that you want to share with people watching this?
Yeah, I'm really like focusing more and more on, in the direction of working with climate anxiety and eco grief and people who are trying to conceive, people who are trying to raise families. And so I'm going to be offering some new coaching offerings around that, but also in the works with a few other people around maybe hosting some community workshops locally here in Durham, North Carolina, around holding space for climate grief and sort of all of the other issues that go along with that. So I'm really excited to see those come together in the next few months.
That is exciting and so necessary, and I don't feel like enough people are doing that work. So thank you for doing it and creating space and community. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for your presence and energy and work and time and just who you are in the world, and for being part of this conversation. And the work that's coming up for you is going to be in the notes that go along with this Healing and Community Summit, so people will know how to get in touch with you and connect with you, and if they want to work with you for coaching or join one of the community conversations you're hosting in the new year, they can. Yeah. And thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you. Always a pleasure to connect with you, Michelle.
Yeah, thank you.